What if the system designed to protect us was the very thing being used to destroy an innocent man? In a courtroom filled with certainty, a 15-year-old boy spots the flaw no one else sees. A digital ghost, a manipulated truth. And now, he's racing against time, against power, against fear itself, to prove what no one wants to believe. But will anyone listen? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The air inside the Chicago Criminal Court was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the skin like damp autumn air. The gallery was packed. Journalists, legal analysts, and curious spectators filled every available seat. Some leaned forward with anticipation, others whispered among themselves, their gazes flicking toward the man seated at the defendant's table. Asa Lockwood sat still, his fingers loosely interlaced, his posture deceptively composed. His suit, once a symbol of his thriving career, now felt constricting, like a noose tightening around his throat. The weight of expectation, of judgment, pressed down on him as he listened to the prosecutor's voice slicing through the courtroom like a blade. Margot Lively, the lead prosecutor, stood confidently addressing the jury. She was methodical, her voice smooth but sharp. Members of the jury, the evidence speaks for itself. On the night of October 12th, at approximately 10:30 p.m., Nathan Reyes was murdered in his office. Who was there? The defendant, Asa Lockwood. The GPS data confirms it. The security cameras confirm it. A witness saw him leaving the scene. This is not speculation. This is fact. Asa's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain still. He had heard it all before, over and over again, the same damning words, the same unwavering certainty. The worst part was, he had no way to fight it. His lawyer, Elliot Kessler, a man in his mid-50s with the battle-worn face of someone who had spent years in courtrooms like this, stood up. Your Honor, the prosecution is making one crucial assumption, that the technology used to place my client at the scene is infallible. But technology is not perfect, and neither is the system built around it. GPS data can be manipulated. Surveillance footage can be misleading. We must ask ourselves, are we truly seeing the whole picture? Judge Warren Slade peered down at Kessler from the bench, his lined face unreadable. He was a man who had presided over countless trials, known for his strict adherence to legal precedent. The jury will decide what they believe to be true, he said, his tone measured. Asa exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to speak, to shout, to beg for someone to actually listen. He had not been there that night. He had not killed Nathan Reyes, and yet the facts painted him as a murderer. From the jury box, the 12 members sat stiffly, their faces carefully neutral. But Asa could feel their judgment. He had seen it before. The way people looked at him now, the way everyone looked at him, was as if he were already behind bars. Asa barely registered the final statements. Everything blurred together. He saw Margot Lively's confident smirk, heard the hushed whispers rippling through the crowd. And then, the moment arrived. Judge Slade straightened in his seat, his gavel resting within reach. Asa Lockwood, this court finds you guilty of first-degree murder, he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. You are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A murmur swept across the courtroom. Some gasped, some nodded, satisfied. Asa felt nothing. No shock, no anger, just a hollow, ringing silence. His entire world had collapsed in the span of seconds. He barely heard Kessler lean in, whispering something about appeals, about not losing hope. But hope had long abandoned him. The bailiffs approached. Cold metal cuffs clicked around his wrists. As they led him away, Asa turned his gaze toward the gallery, where people celebrated his downfall, where cameras captured his defeat. He let his eyes drift across the sea of faces, expecting to see only indifference. But then, he saw him, a boy. 15-year-old Jude Callahan sat on the couch in his small apartment, a bowl of untouched cereal in front of him. The trial had been playing on their old television all morning, and he had been following every second of it. His mother had left for work hours ago, assuming he was getting ready for school. But Jude wasn't at school. He hadn't been able to look away from the case, and now as he watched Asa Lockwood being led away in cuffs, his fingers tightened around the TV remote. Something was wrong. Jude didn't trust easy answers. He had spent years digging into information, learning how systems worked, how they could be manipulated. And something about this case, it didn't add up. He reached for his laptop, scrolling through archived data from the city's traffic cameras. His sharp brown eyes darted across lines of code and timestamps, his mind working faster than most adults in the room. GPS data, video footage, witness testimony. It was all too perfect, too clean. His breath caught as he saw it. The first glitch, a timestamp error in the GPS logs. His heart pounded. Wait a minute. His fingers flew across the keyboard, opening files, running comparisons. The more he looked, the more cracks he found. Jude knew he had stumbled onto something, but the question was, what was he going to do about it? Outside, the sounds of Chicago's South Side filtered through the slightly cracked window. Cars passing, the occasional distant siren, and the chatter of people returning home from work. The room smelled faintly of his mother's cooking from earlier in the evening, but his mind was elsewhere. He had been replaying Asa Lockwood's trial in his head all day. Something wasn't right. He knew it. He could feel it. His mother, Emma Callahan, moved about in the tiny kitchen, her uniform still on from her double shift at the diner. She glanced at Jude, shaking her head as she wiped down the counter. "You've been staring at that screen all evening," she said, exhaling. "Aren't you supposed to be working on school assignments?" Jude barely looked up. "It's important." Emma frowned, setting down the rag. "Jude, baby, whatever it is, it can wait till morning." Jude hesitated, torn between brushing it off and explaining. But his gut told him this wasn't just a passing curiosity. He turned his screen slightly, showing her the trial footage paused on Asa Lockwood's face. "You see this guy? Everyone thinks he's guilty." He pointed to the evidence timestamps on the bottom of the screen. "But look at this. Something's off with the GPS data. I think somebody set him up." Emma's expression shifted from concern to exhaustion. "Jude," she sighed, rubbing her temple. "I know you're smart, smarter than most people I know. But this is grown folks' business. You can't just—" "What if he really didn't do it?" Jude interrupted, his voice insistent. "What if nobody else is checking?" Emma hesitated. For all her worries, she knew one thing about her son. Once he set his mind on something, there was no stopping him. She sighed, reaching for her purse. "I don't want you getting into trouble, you hear me? You be careful." Jude nodded, but in his head, he was already diving into the data. Jude worked in silence, fingers tapping quickly across the keyboard. He cross-referenced the trial footage with public records, city logs, and security feeds. Sources most people didn't even think to check. That's when he saw it. The GPS log of Asa's phone placed him at the crime scene at exactly 10:30 p.m. The court had treated it like gospel, but Jude knew better. He pulled up footage from a traffic camera a few blocks away, one that was time-stamped at 10:27 p.m., 3 minutes before Asa was supposedly at the crime scene. The camera showed Asa's car driving away. Jude's pulse kicked up. He replayed it, twice. Then he ran a software overlay, mapping the movement against the trial's GPS data. And there it was, the smoking gun. The GPS data had been altered. Someone had gone in and manually adjusted Asa's location, making it appear as if he had been at the crime scene longer than he actually was. Jude sat back in his chair, breath caught in his throat. "This ain't right," he muttered. If the GPS data was fake, then the entire case against Asa Lockwood was built on a lie. Jude knew he couldn't keep this to himself, but who would believe a 15-year-old kid? He needed help, someone who knew how deep this kind of thing could go. There was only one person he could trust with something like this, Mr. Calvin Marks, his computer science teacher. Jude arrived at Northside Tech Academy early the next morning, long before the first bell rang. He found Mr. Marks in his classroom, sipping coffee while grading assignments. The teacher barely had time to greet him before Jude pulled up the laptop. "You gotta see this," Jude said, breathless. "It's about the Asa Lockwood case. The GPS data was tampered with." Mr. Marks frowned, setting down his coffee. "Hold on. What are you saying?" Jude launched into an explanation, showing the discrepancies between the timestamps. the security camera footage, and the logs. He talked fast, his excitement growing as he laid it all out. When he finished, Mr. Marks sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a low whistle. Damn! He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. You realize what you're saying, right? That somebody with serious access, falsified government records. Jude nodded. Yeah, and if I can prove it, then Asa Lockwood's innocent. Mr. Marks studied him for a long moment, then sighed. This isn't just a school project, Jude. You're stepping into some very dangerous territory. Whoever did this, they're not going to want it coming out. Jude swallowed. He knew it was risky, but the truth mattered more. So what do I do? Marks hesitated before speaking. You've already found the cracks, he said. Now you need to find out who made them. But you've got to be smart about it. Cover your tracks. If you make too much noise too soon, Jude nodded, his mind racing. I get it. Move quiet. Marks sighed, rubbing his temple. Damn, kid, you're either real brave or real foolish. Jude grinned, packing up his laptop. Maybe a little of both. Jude sat at his desk, eyes locked on his laptop screen, fingers moving with practiced speed over the keyboard. The soft hum of the computer filled the quiet apartment. His mother had already gone to bed after another long shift, leaving him alone in the dim glow of the monitor. His heart pounded as he navigated through layers of encryption, bypassing firewalls that shouldn't have been so easy to crack. He had spent years learning how systems worked, but this was different. He wasn't just playing around in the back end of a school server. He was diving into a government database. He pulled up Chicago's traffic management system, where GPS data from thousands of vehicles, public and private, were stored. He cross-referenced it with the case evidence from Asa's trial. He knew what he was looking for. And then, there it was. Jude's stomach tightened. The system had been accessed and altered 2 days before Nathan Reyes was murdered. Someone had gone in and manually adjusted Asa Lockwood's location data, making it seem like he had been at the crime scene long after he had left. Jude leaned back, exhaling. His fingers felt numb. This wasn't just a mistake. This was intentional. He clicked through the logs, searching for the user responsible for the edits. But whoever had done this knew how to cover their tracks. The logs had been wiped, leaving only a generic system ID, one that led to a private security firm. Jude's pulse quickened. If someone had gone to the trouble of faking evidence, they weren't going to let a 15-year-old kid unravel their work without a fight. Jude was about to log out when a message box popped up on his screen. At first, he thought it was a system notification. Then he saw the words, "Stop now while you can, kid." Jude's breath hitched. The message disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. He clicked through his system logs, scanning for any sign of intrusion. And then, his screen flickered. Files started disappearing. Someone was inside his computer. Right now. Jude's stomach dropped. He yanked out the external hard drive on his desk and slammed it into the USB port. His hands moved fast, copying everything he had before it could be deleted. More files vanished. Lines of code scrambled before his eyes. He didn't have time. He grabbed his phone and opened his email, attaching the most crucial files, everything he had on the GPS tampering. He typed in a single address, calvin.marks@northsidetech.edu sent. Seconds later, his laptop screen went black. Jude's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his heart hammering. Then a new message appeared on his phone screen. "You think this is a game? Walk away." Elliot Kessler adjusted his reading glasses, the dull glow of his computer screen casting shadows over his tired face. The email had come anonymously. At first, he thought it was spam, some internet conspiracy theorist trying to insert himself into the case. But when he clicked on the attachment, his heart skipped a beat. He scanned the files once, then again. If this was real, it changed everything. He grabbed his phone and dialed the correctional facility where Asa Lockwood was being held. 15 minutes later, Asa sat across from him in a dimly lit visitor's room, his hands shackled to the table. His eyes, once dull with resignation, held something different now, a flicker of something Kessler hadn't seen in months. Hope. Kessler leaned forward. "I don't know who sent this, but if it holds up, you might have a shot." Asa swallowed, his throat dry. "Who sent it?" Kessler shook his head. They didn't leave a name, just an anonymous email. But whoever they are, they just became our best chance. Jude paced his small bedroom, his heart still racing. He knew he had just crossed a line. Whoever was behind this wasn't just some hacker covering their tracks. They had power. Real power. He glanced at his laptop, now completely fried. His phone vibrated again. One final message. Last warning, kid. Jude clenched his fists. This wasn't over. Not even close. Jude stirred awake to the sound of something scraping against the front door. His eyes flicked to the clock. 2:14 a.m. The apartment was still, the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the window blinds. For a second, he thought he had imagined it. But then, the handle turned. His stomach tightened. Jude slipped out of bed, moving as quietly as he could. His mother's room was at the other end of the hall. If someone was trying to break in, he had to act fast. He tiptoed toward his desk, heart hammering, reaching for the metal flashlight he kept near his laptop. A faint creak. The door inched open. Jude's fingers curled around the flashlight just as a dark figure slipped inside. The man moved low, careful, dressed in all black. His movements were precise. He wasn't just a random thief. He was looking for something. Jude barely had time to process the thought before his mother's voice cut through the silence. "Who's there?" The man froze. Then, a blur of movement. Emma flipped on the hallway light, her face going from groggy confusion to pure terror in a second. Jude didn't think. He swung the flashlight as hard as he could, the metal cracking against the intruder's forearm. The man grunted in pain, but before Jude could get another hit in, the stranger shoved him backward and bolted for the door. Emma grabbed the landline and called 911 as the man disappeared down the stairwell. Jude sat there, heart pounding, watching the door swing shut. His mother rounded on him. "Jude!" she choked out, her hands trembling. "What the hell is going on?" The police came and went, asking questions, taking notes, promising an investigation. But Jude already knew what this was. It wasn't some random break-in. Someone had sent a message. Emma sat on the couch, arms crossed, her expression set in stone. "This stops now," she said, voice shaking. "You're done, Jude." Jude swallowed hard. "Mom, no," she snapped. "No arguments. I let you play detective because I thought maybe this was just some curiosity thing. But now, someone just broke into our home, Jude. What if I hadn't woken up? What if—" She trailed off, pressing a hand over her mouth. Jude felt sick. She was scared, more scared than he'd ever seen her. But if he backed down now, Asa Lockwood was never getting out of prison. "Mom," he said quietly, "if I don't do this, who will?" Emma's eyes flashed. "Not you. You're a kid, Jude. You're a kid who just found proof that a man is going to spend the rest of his life in prison for something he didn't do." Jude interrupted. "You really want me to walk away from that?" Emma stood up, gripping the edge of the couch. "I want you alive." Silence stretched between them. Jude's throat tightened. He could feel how much this was hurting her. But walking away? That wasn't an option. Finally, his mother exhaled shakily. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. Jude nodded, but deep down he knew. This was just the beginning. By sunrise, Jude was back on his laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Whoever broke into his apartment was trying to bury something, which meant he was close. He combed through the traffic camera data again, scanning frame by frame. And then he found it, a single untouched security feed. The footage showed a black SUV pulling away from the crime scene at 10:32 p.m., right after Nathan Reyes was murdered. The license plate was partially obscured, but Jude enhanced the image, running it through a public records search. The name that popped up made his stomach drop. Edward Langston. Jude sat back, exhaling sharply. Edward Langston wasn't just anybody. He was a major investor in Asa Lockwood's company, and now he was suddenly connected to the crime scene. Someone had framed Asa to protect Langston. But the real question was, who was pulling the strings? Jude compressed the files into a secure folder and drafted an email. To elliot.kessler@lockwooddefense.com. Subject: urgent, new evidence. Attaching the footage, Jude hesitated for only a second before hitting send. Seconds later, his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "We warned you." Jude stared at the words, his pulse thudding in his ears. They knew. They were watching. And they weren't done yet. In an upscale office downtown, Margot Lively sat across from a man whose face never made the papers. His suit was impeccable, his demeanor cold as steel. "You assured me this was taken care of," she said, voice tight. The man tilted his head. "It was, and yet your case is falling apart." Margot exhaled sharply. "The retrial isn't official yet. You can still fix this?" The man cut in, "before it becomes a problem." She didn't respond. The man stood, smoothing out his tie. "Make sure Asa Lockwood stays where he is." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "And deal with the kid." Margot sat there, fingers tightening into fists. She had worked too hard to let everything unravel now. And if that meant stopping Jude Callahan, so be it. The tension in Chicago criminal court was suffocating. The air hummed with anticipation, a mixture of whispered speculation and the rapid clicks of reporters' keyboards. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, with some people standing along the back wall just to catch a glimpse of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just another trial. This was a spectacle. At the defense table, Elliot Kessler adjusted his tie, taking a measured breath. He had been in courtrooms for decades, but today he was relying on evidence that hadn't come from forensic analysts or seasoned investigators. It had come from a 15-year-old kid. The judge entered and the courtroom rose to its feet. Judge Warren Slade, with his deep-set eyes and air of impatience, settled into his chair and scanned the room before rapping his gavel. "We are here to address a motion for retrial in the case of the state versus Asa Lockwood," he announced. "The defense claims to have new evidence that may challenge the integrity of the original conviction. Mr. Kessler, proceed." Kessler stood, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, we have obtained digital evidence that suggests the GPS records used to place Mr. Lockwood at the crime scene were tampered with. Furthermore, a security camera, previously overlooked, recorded a black SUV leaving the scene at the time of the murder, contradicting the prosecution's timeline." Judge Slade's gaze darkened. "And where did this evidence originate?" Kessler exhaled. "Your Honor, it was discovered by a young investigator who specializes in digital forensics." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Slade raised a skeptical brow. "A young investigator?" Kessler turned slightly toward the gallery. "Jude Callahan, please step forward." Jude took slow, measured steps toward the witness stand, but his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The weight of the courtroom pressed down on him, the murmur of the crowd like a distant roar in his ears. He gripped the edges of his sleeves, his palms slick with sweat. This wasn't just about proving a theory anymore. This was about proving himself. The bailiff approached, raising a hand. "Raise your right hand." Jude did as he was told, his fingers trembling slightly. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" His voice came out steadier than he expected. "I do." He lowered his hand, sat down, and felt the stares. The press, scribbling furiously, the jury, exchanging skeptical glances. And then there was Margot Lively, standing at the prosecution's table, arms folded across her chest. She didn't even look concerned, just amused. Then Judge Warren Slade spoke, his deep voice carrying through the courtroom. "Mr. Callahan," he said, peering down at Jude over the rim of his glasses, "would you kindly tell the court how old you are?" Jude swallowed hard. 15. A ripple of low laughter spread through the room. A few of the jurors exchanged doubtful smirks, and someone near the back snorted. Slade raised an eyebrow, leaning forward with mock curiosity. 15, you say? He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Well, well, this is a first. In my 30 years on this bench, I don't believe I've ever had a child come in here and tell me how the law works. The room buzzed with murmurs. Jude's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Slade wasn't finished. Tell me, Mr. Callahan, do they teach legal procedure in high school these days? He scoffed, tapping his gavel lightly. Or should we all be taking lessons from a sophomore now? A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Jude felt his face flush, but he held his ground. Margot Lively leaned forward, a smirk tugging at her lips. Your Honor, I couldn't have said it better myself. She turned toward the jury, gesturing lazily toward Jude. A 15-year-old hacker, Your Honor, and we're expected to believe that this boy somehow uncovered what trained forensic analysts and legal experts failed to see? Jude could feel the doubt creeping in the eyes of the jury, in the smirks of the courtroom. But he wasn't here to impress them. He was here to tell the truth. Jude inhaled deeply. Then slowly he met Slade's gaze head-on. I don't need a law degree, he said, his voice even, to know when something doesn't add up. The room fell silent. Judge Slade blinked, his smirk faltering just slightly. Margot Lively's expression hardened. Jude squared his shoulders. And if you'd let me show you, he continued, I can prove it. Slade exhaled sharply, adjusting his glasses. His tone was flat, unimpressed, but something in his posture had shifted. Proceed, Mr. Callahan. Jude pulled out his notes, steadying his breath. This was it. Jude started with the GPS data. The system logs show an unauthorized access to the city's GPS records 2 days before the murder. That's when Asa Lockwood's location was manually altered to make it seem like he was at the crime scene longer than he actually was. He paused to let that sink in before pulling up a printed copy of the security footage he had found. This is from a traffic camera that wasn't included in the original trial. It shows a black SUV leaving the crime scene at exactly 10:32 p.m., right when Nathan Reyes was killed. Asa's GPS was still showing him at the building at this time, which means, he glanced at the jury, someone used the GPS system to frame him. A ripple spread through the crowd. Even the jurors, who had remained neutral so far, were leaning in. Kessler stepped forward, reinforcing Jude's point. If the court allows us to verify this data against the city's secure records, we can confirm that Mr. Lockwood's GPS was manipulated. Judge Slade let out a slow breath, glancing at the prosecution. Ms. Lively? Margot Lively stood, smoothing her blazer. This is cute, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. A boy with a laptop thinks he can outsmart the justice system. She turned toward Jude. You think we don't verify our evidence? That a team of forensic analysts missed something, but you, a teenager, found it in your bedroom? The way she said teenager made Jude's blood boil. I think, he said, keeping his voice even, that somebody wanted Asa in prison, and they were willing to cheat to make it happen. That was the moment the energy in the courtroom shifted. Margot's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. But then, Jude's gut twisted. His eyes flicked to the printed screenshot of the traffic camera footage. Something was wrong. His heartbeat spiked as he scanned the page. The timestamp, the one that had shown 10:32 p.m., was gone. Instead, the new timestamp read 10:45 p.m., a full 13 minutes later. The black SUV was still there, but now instead of proving Asa was innocent, the footage meant nothing. Jude's stomach dropped. Someone had altered the evidence. Margot Lively pounced instantly. Your Honor, she said smoothly, this is exactly what I was warning about. This is sloppy, unreliable work. She turned toward the jury. A child playing with video files thinking he can dismantle an entire case? This is what the defense is basing their retrial on? Jude felt the weight of every doubtful stare in the room pressing down on him. He turned to Kessler, panic rising in his chest. What happened? He whispered. Kessler looked grim. The data was altered after you sent it. Jude's blood ran cold. Someone had gotten to the evidence before it reached the court. Judge Slade sighed, rubbing his temple. At this time, I find this new evidence insufficient to warrant a retrial. Jude's throat closed up. This couldn't be happening. Asa, sitting in his orange jumpsuit, closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. This was exactly what they wanted. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Margot Lively sat down victorious. Jude's hands fisted at his sides. They had won today, but this wasn't over. Jude sat hunched over his laptop at the back of Northside Tech Academy's computer lab, the hum of the server room filling the air. The glow of the screen reflected in his wide, determined eyes. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard as he navigated layers of security protocols, searching for traces of the digital sabotage that had destroyed his evidence in court. His stomach churned with frustration. Someone had altered his data, and they had done it too well. It wasn't just a simple hack. This was the work of a professional. He needed help. Jude grabbed his phone and called Calvin Marks. The classroom door creaked open, and Mr. Marks stepped inside, his face etched with concern. He had seen Jude in deep focus before, but this was different. The kid looked rattled. "What the hell are you into, Jude?" Marks asked, dropping his bag on the desk. Jude's eyes didn't leave the screen. "Somebody wiped my evidence before it made it to court. They didn't just edit the footage. They altered the metadata to make it look like I faked it." Marks pulled up a chair, his jaw tightening. "That's not just some basement hacker screwing around. This is big league stuff." Jude exhaled sharply. "I need to know who did it." Marks hesitated, then cracked his knuckles and started typing. "Let's see what we're dealing with." They worked in silence for the next 30 minutes. Then Marks cursed under his breath. "They didn't erase everything," he muttered. "They left a signature, a traceable IP from an external server." He tapped the screen. "And it's coming from a secure police database." Jude's stomach dropped. "Wait, you're saying someone inside the police department altered the evidence?" Marks nodded grimly. "And unless we can access their internal systems, we won't be able to reverse it." Jude's mind raced. If they wanted to fix this, they needed deep access, something only an officer or someone high up in law enforcement could get. But there was no time to think, because at that moment, Jude's phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Stop now, kid. You're out of your league." Jude's hands clenched into fists. He had pushed too far, and now they knew exactly where he was. Downtown, inside a private office, Margot Lively sat across from Edward Langston, who was watching the courtroom footage of Jude Callahan on his tablet. His expression was impassive, but the flicker of irritation in his eyes told her he wasn't pleased. "This boy is a problem," Langston said, setting the tablet down. "I thought you had control of this case." Margot resisted the urge to snap back. "I do. The evidence against Lockwood is still intact. The retrial was denied." Langston leaned forward. "Yet somehow a teenager came close to unraveling our work, and he's still digging. This is unacceptable." Margot met his gaze. "You're saying we need to—" Langston cut her off. "I'm saying the boy needs to understand consequences. Make him scared enough to walk away. And if that doesn't work—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Margot exhaled, rubbing her temple. She wasn't comfortable with this, but Langston had too much riding on Asa Lockwood staying in prison. A silent understanding passed between them. Langston picked up his phone and made a call. Jude left the school later than usual. His nerves were already on edge, but he told himself he was just being paranoid. Then he noticed something. Two men dressed in dark clothing were standing near a parked car across the street. They weren't talking. They weren't checking their phones. They were just watching him. Jude's throat tightened. He picked up his pace. The men started moving too. Jude's instinct screamed at him, "Run." He bolted, weaving through the sidewalk, past pedestrians who barely noticed the sudden chase happening in real time. His backpack bounced against his shoulders as he turned a sharp corner into an alley. But the moment he skidded into the narrow space, he realized his mistake. A third man stepped out from the shadows. Jude's heart pounded as he stumbled backward, trapped between the three figures. His mind raced. Was this just a warning, or were they going to do more? Then, a blinding flash of headlights. A car screeched into the alley, tires skidding against the pavement. The passenger door flew open. "Jude, get in!" Elliot Kessler. Jude didn't hesitate. He lunged into the car, slamming the door behind him just as the vehicle peeled away, leaving the men behind in the dust. His chest heaved as he turned to Kessler. "How did you—" Kessler kept his eyes on the road, jaw tight. "Let's just say I had a feeling you'd need an escape route." Jude exhaled shakily, gripping the seatbelt. Whoever was behind this, they weren't just trying to scare him. They were ready to make him disappear. Jude sat in Kessler's office, still shaken. The older man poured him a glass of water, setting it in front of him before taking a seat. "Whoever is behind this," Kessler said carefully, "they're getting desperate." Jude swallowed. "That means we're close," Kessler nodded. Which is why we need to move fast. Jude rubbed his temples. We have proof that the police database was used to alter the evidence, but we need someone on the inside to pull the original files before they're erased for good. Kessler leaned back, considering. Then an idea clicked. I might know someone. Jude looked up. Who? Kessler didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up his phone and dialed. Detective Avery, we need to talk. The atmosphere inside Chicago Criminal Court was thick with tension. Every seat in the gallery was filled, the murmurs of spectators barely hushed by the weight of what was about to happen. The courtroom had become a battlefield, and Judge Warren Slade was moments away from delivering the final blow. At the prosecution's table, Margot Lively sat with an air of quiet confidence, her hands folded neatly. She had spent years in this room, tearing apart defendants and their lawyers alike, and today was no different. The retrial had been denied, and Asa Lockwood was set to remain in prison for the rest of his life. The case was done. Slade cleared his throat, his gavel resting within reach. After careful consideration of the presented arguments, the court finds no sufficient. But before he could finish, Elliot Kessler rose to his feet. Your Honor, he interrupted, his voice steady but urgent. We have a final piece of evidence that must be considered before a decision is made. The murmurs in the courtroom exploded into whispers. Margot's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. Slade let out a slow, measured breath. Mr. Kessler, I was under the impression that the defense had exhausted all attempts to introduce new evidence. Kessler glanced toward the gallery. That was before we recovered the original, unaltered footage, proving beyond doubt that Asa Lockwood was not at the crime scene at the time of the murder. Gas rippled through the courtroom. Margot's expression barely faltered, but there was the slightest shift, a crack in the carefully controlled facade. Slade leaned forward. You're saying the original footage still exists? Kessler nodded. And we have someone who can explain exactly how it was recovered? He turned toward the gallery. Jude Callahan, please take the stand. The room hushed as Jude walked toward the witness stand. He had never been in front of so many people in his life, but he forced himself to move with confidence. This was it. The bailiff swore him in. He sat down, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden seat. State your name for the court, Slade instructed. Jude Callahan, he answered, voice steady. Kessler stepped forward. Mr. Callahan, you were involved in the original discovery of manipulated GPS data, correct? Jude nodded. Yes, sir. And were you also able to recover the uncorrupted footage from the traffic camera near the crime scene? Jude straightened in his seat. Yes. With help from my teacher, Mr. Marks, I was able to retrieve the original video file before it was completely wiped. Kessler turned to the judge. We request permission to present this evidence. Slade hesitated, then nodded toward the bailiff. Proceed. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a screen at the front of the room lit up. Jude's heart pounded as the unedited video played. A grainy black and white image appeared. The street outside Nathan Rhea's office. The timestamp in the corner read 10:27 p.m. Then a car pulled out of the parking lot, Asa Lockwood's car. Exactly 10 minutes before the murder occurred. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Kessler turned back to Jude. Can you confirm, under oath, that this is the untouched original footage? Jude nodded. Yes, this version was stored in a backup archive and hadn't been tampered with. Kessler looked toward the judge. Your Honor, this contradicts the GPS data used to convict Mr. Lockwood. The prosecution claimed he was inside the building at 10:30 p.m. But here we have visual proof that he was already gone. Slade's fingers tightened on the gavel. He turned to the prosecution. Ms. Lively, he said, his tone sharp, would you care to explain this? Margot Lively stood slowly, smoothing out her blazer. She was calculating, scanning the room, searching for a way out. Your Honor, she began, her voice even, this new evidence is interesting, but it does not necessarily prove that. Slade raised a hand, cutting her off. It proves that the evidence used in the original trial was falsified, he said firmly. And if that's the case, then this entire conviction is now in question. Margot's jaw clenched. For the first time, she looked uncertain. And then, the final blow came. A low cough sounded from the gallery. Edward Langston. He had been sitting quietly for most of the trial, watching, waiting, but now he was visibly tense. Kessler turned toward him. Funny, isn't it, Mr. Langston, that a man with your resources was so closely involved with Asa Lockwood's company, and yet somehow everything fell apart the moment Asa was taken out of the equation. Langston said nothing, but his fingers twitched against his knee, and the jury noticed. Judge Slade let out a slow breath. Then he turned to Margot. I will ask you one last time, he said, his voice dangerously calm. Did the prosecution knowingly rely on false evidence to secure a conviction? Margot didn't answer, because she couldn't. The silence was deafening. Finally, Slade leaned forward. The court will adjourn for a recess, he declared, at which time I will determine whether this case should be overturned. His gavel came down hard, and just like that, the prosecution's entire case was hanging by a thread. Jude sat frozen in his chair. They had done it. They had turned the tide. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, but the kind that precedes a storm. Every eye in the room was locked onto Judge Warren Slade, who sat rigidly on the bench, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom like a heavy weight pressing down on every soul inside. The air was thick with tension. Slade cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone before him. This court has carefully reviewed the evidence presented in this case, he began, his voice steady but carrying a weight that could not be ignored. The evidence originally used to convict Asa Lockwood has been found to be compromised, the result of deliberate tampering and fraudulent manipulation of digital records. He let the words hang in the air. A hush fell over the room. Slade continued. In light of these developments, this court finds that there is no legal basis to uphold the conviction against Mr. Lockwood. Therefore, the ruling of this court is as follows. A pause, then the hammer of justice fell. Asa Lockwood is hereby cleared of all charges and is to be released immediately. For a brief moment, Asa Lockwood sat frozen, as if his mind refused to accept the reality of what he had just heard. Then it hit him. The chains binding his wrists suddenly felt lighter. He turned to Elliot Kessler, who gave him a knowing nod. On the other side of the room, Jude Callahan grinned, a mixture of exhaustion and triumph dancing in his young eyes. And then, the courtroom exploded. Gasps, murmurs, shouts. The walls vibrated with disbelief and shock. Boydum John members exchanged uneasy glances, realization dawning on them. They had come within inches of condemning an innocent man. The reporters in the gallery scrambled to take notes, cameras flashing. Asa finally let out a shaky breath, his body slumping against the chair. He was free. Margot Lively's lips pressed into a thin line. She had lost cases before. That was the nature of her job, but never like this. Never this publicly, this humiliatingly, this catastrophically. Slade wasn't finished. Given the nature of this egregious misconduct, an internal investigation will be opened into the handling of this case. His gaze landed on Margot and she looked shaken. But the real blow came when the doors to the courtroom suddenly burst open. 2 federal agents stepped inside, and behind them, Edward Langston, in handcuffs. Langston's usually composed, commanding demeanor was nowhere to be found. His suit was still immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted. But there was no confidence in his step as he was escorted into the room. The whispers in the courtroom spiked. Slade's gaze darkened. Mr. Langston, you are hereby being placed under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and tampering with legal evidence. Langston's jaw tightened. They won't prove anything, he hissed under his breath. One of the agents smirked. We already did. Jude watched it unfold, his hands still clutching the edge of his chair. He saw something in Langston's expression that wasn't arrogance. It was fear. The sun was blindingly bright when Asa Lockwood stepped out of the Cook County Jail, dressed in a fresh but slightly oversized suit Kessler had brought for him. The air felt different, cleaner, like he could finally breathe again. Jude and Kessler were waiting for him. Jude leaned against a lamppost, his backpack slung over one shoulder, looking casual, as if he hadn't just helped bring down one of the most corrupt trials in Chicago's history. Asa exhaled, shaking his head as he approached them. Kessler smirked. You're free. Asa chuckled under his breath. Didn't think I'd hear those words. He turned to Jude. I don't know how to thank you, man. If it weren't for you, Jude shrugged, grinning. Guess that means you owe me a burger. Asa laughed, the sound genuine. Kid, I'll buy you a whole damn restaurant. News of the wrongful conviction scandal spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about Asa Lockwood anymore. It was about the system. For weeks, news stations ran segments questioning the validity of digital evidence in court, debating whether GPS logs and security footage could be so easily manipulated. A nationwide conversation began about criminal justice reform and the reliance on technology in legal proceedings. And at the center of it all, a 15-year-old hacker from Chicago. The emails started rolling in almost immediately. Law firms, cybersecurity firms, investigative agencies, all wanting to meet with Jude Callahan. One offer stood out. A private cybersecurity firm was offering a full-ride scholarship, training, education, everything. His mother had cried when she saw the letter. Jude just sat there, grinning like an idiot, because he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He wasn't just some kid messing with computers anymore. He was going to protect the truth. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about truth. And sometimes truth doesn't reveal itself easily. It takes courage to question, to dig deeper, to stand against a system that wants you silent. Jude Callahan proved that one voice, even a young one, can make a difference. But how many innocent people have been lost to the cracks in a system that favors power over proof? What would you do if the truth was right in front of you, but no one wanted to see it? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more tales of mystery, justice, and the fight for what's right. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones no one wants to tell.